Thank you very much. First, some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Professor Bill Graham and Mohsen for helping me out with this paper. When it comes to jihad in the Qur'an, modern Western scholars can be divided into two broad camps. Those on the one hand who believe in the traditional reading of the jihadic passages, and those on the other hand who argue for a polyphonic reading of the text. According to the traditional schema, jihad progressed in 4 stages, starting from pacifism at the start of the prophetic mission, all the way to aggressive, perpetual holy war, by the prophet's death. However, according to the polyphonic reading, in fact, no coherent doctrine can be discerned from the Qur'an, which is often ambiguous on the issue of warfare. This is a view held by such respectable scholars as Rudolf Peters, Michael Bonner, and Reuven Firestone, all of whom have written books on the topic of jihad. Furthermore, Professor Firestone writes that the conflicting verses of Revelation articulate the views of different factions existing simultaneously within the early Muslim community. That is to say, the Quran contains within it multiple viewpoints and perhaps multiple authors. My thesis, however, is that, in fact, the Quran does have a coherent doctrine of warfare, which comes into focus when we consider its relationship to qisas. Qisas is the mihwar, or the central axis around which jihad revolves. It is the superstructure under which warfare operates. As for my methodology, basically I did a very close reading of the Quranic text. I relied on intra-Quranic context as much as possible. I was very skeptical of extra-Quranic sources, including the Asbab al-Nuzul literature, the Hadith, as well as the Tafasir. If I did look for extra-Quranic sources, I relied on the pre-Islamic sources because I believe that this is the context in which the Qur'an was revealed and to whom it was speaking. In this way, my study is not too different than the famous one done by Toshihiko Izutsu. So, my approach is to respect the text and read it on its own terms and avoid atomistic or sub-atomistic readings. Briefly, my conclusions are as follows. Warfare in the Quran operates under 5 principles, which revolve around qisas, and there are also 5 virtues, which I'll get into. Turning to the pre-Islamic era, we see that qisas was how one tribe checked another tribe. If you killed someone from my tribe, I'd kill someone from your tribe. Of course, I could also accept financial restitution. You could give me a certain number of camels, but that was considered less honorable, maybe even an effeminate option. It was considered accepting milk when you really should be accepting blood for blood. There was the concept of equality, of proportionate response. So if you killed my chief, I would kill your chief. But sometimes what would happen is one tribe would consider itself greater than the other and would demand greater than equal retaliation. So if we pretend that this half of the class or of the room is Bunny Harvard, and this side of the class is Bunny Yale, and someone from Bunny Yale killed a PhD student from Bunny Harvard, Bunny Harvard would be legitimated in retaliating against a PhD student from Yale. That would be parity. But perhaps Bunny Harvard would say, hey, we're Harvard, our PhD student, your PhD student, there's no comparison. We demand in retaliation a professor. So this would create a conflict, and this would lead to endless blood feuds. The paradigmatic case of this is the War of Bessus, which started over the killing of a she-camel. When terms could not be come to because of this issue of parity, it resulted in an endless blood feud. So this is the context in which the Qur'an was revealed and speaking to, and the Qur'anic discourse is calling back to the principle of qisas. If we look at this verse of this passage of the Qur'an, O you who believe, equal retribution is prescribed for you in cases of the killed, the free man for the free man, the slave for the slave, the female for the female, the PhD student for the PhD student. So it was setting equal retaliation as the upper limit, but it was also pushing later for forgiveness. Now this passage historically has been understood by Muslims as referring to the domestic crime of murder. But I would argue that it doesn't make much sense from that perspective. if, and I wouldn't do this, but if, let's say, I killed one of the women in the audience, it wouldn't make sense for the state to punish another woman for that crime. So I don't think it makes much sense as far as murder is concerned. I think this has to do with tribal warfare. So, again, going to the example, if Bunny Yale killed a woman from Bunny Harvard could say, hey, you killed one of our women, we're going to kill one of yours. I think that context makes a lot more sense. And that seems to be supported by the tafsir. Turning to another passage, we see the same thing. The believers are those who defend themselves when they are oppressed. So we know that this passage has to do with warfare. The recompense for an injury is an injury equal to it, but if anyone forgives and reconciles, such will have his reward from God. So it was setting, I apologize. It was setting the upper limit as equal retaliation, but it was still pushing for an ethic of forgiveness. So here we see the inversion of the Jahili mentality, where accepting financial restitution or forgiveness was considered a source of cowardice. It was saying, no, in fact, if a person is patient and forgives, this is one of the greatest of things. It takes a lot of fortitude to do that. If you look at another passage, we see again the link between jihad and qisas. The first half is clearly about warfare, and the second half in red says, and whoever has retaliated to an injury with equal to it or no greater than equal to it, he received, and he is again oppressed, God will surely help him. So we clearly see this link between jihad and qisas. And I do not think that qisas is something that can be abrogated or phased out, because in the Quranic discourse, it is considered something pre-eternal and even transcendental. We see here that it goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. And when God decreed to the children of Israel the rule of qisas, don't kill anyone, but if you do kill anyone, then there's a right to retaliate. It's transcendental because even on the Day of Judgment, if a ram hits another ram, that ram, the aggrieved ram, will be able to retaliate. Why? Because that maintains a sense of cosmic justice. So we can call this the proportionality principle. Derived from it is the non-aggression principle, la ta'tadu. We see this in verse 2190. Fight in God's cause against those who fight you, but do not aggress, for God does not love aggressors. It makes a little bit more sequential sense if we flip this around. If we flip this around, we get, do not aggress, for God loves not the aggressors. Fight in God's cause only against those who fight you. We see in another verse, so whoever commits aggression against you, attack him as he attacked you. And yet another one, permission to fight is granted to those who have been attacked because they have been wronged. Here we see another one. There's no cause to act against anyone who defends himself after being wronged, but there is cause to act against those who oppress people and transgress in the land without right, bila haq. Which haq are they talking about? Which right are they talking about? They're talking about the right granted by qisas. Here again we see that it's a pre-eternal value. It's going all the way back to the children of Israel, where God is accusing them of, you are guilty of killing amongst yourselves and banishing a party of your people from their homes, cooperating against them in sin and aggression, al-udwan. Here we see the link also between killing and banishing people. So I see this move in the Quran as well, where exiling people from their homes is linked to killing and does trigger a proportionate response. So these two principles are then rooted in the sanctity of life, hurmat an-nafs. We see this very clearly in another verse, verse 1733. Do not take life which God has made sacred except by right, bila haq. If anyone is killed wrongfully, now we see clearly, qisas, we have given his heir authority. To what? To demand equal retaliation. But he may not exceed beyond that in killing, for he is already aided by God. How is he aided? He is aided by being given the right to retaliate. Here we see that the sanctity of life is right up there with shirk, so violating it is one of the gravest of crimes. Rounding out the 5 principles, we also have the covenant principle and the principle of collective defense. So what's the relationship between this and qisas? Well, let's say Bunny Yale aggresses against Bunny Harvard, kills a bunch of people. Now, people come up to Mohsen and say, Mohsen, you're a PhD student here at Harvard. We need you to fight in our defense. Mohsen says, you know what, I'm working on my dissertation, I'm almost done. I have a job lined up already. I'd rather not get involved. Maybe I want to go to Yale afterward. And so he would be guilty of violating his covenant with Harvard, and he would also be guilty of not coming to the aid of them. So he'd violate the principle of collective defense, and he would be one of the munafiqun, one of the hypocrites. So, I have to breeze through this really quickly, but basically the covenant was an idea from pre-Islamic era, because these were tribes. The only way to maintain any semblance of peace was to be faithful to your oaths. So the Quranic context just came to reinforce that. So it says, "O you who believe, be true to your covenants." Here we see the clear linkage between covenants and qisas, and not the non-aggression principle. We, God, took a covenant from you. Do not shed one another's blood or drive one another from your homelands. Then you ratified our covenant, and you were witnesses thereto. Yet here you are, killing one another and driving some of your own people from their homes, helping one another in sin and aggression against them. You had no right to drive them out. All right. Just one more. Where believers, so the Quran is actually accusing the enemies of being treacherous as well as of committing aggression, and we see that here. Where believers are concerned, they respect no tie of kinship or treaty. They are the ones who are committing aggression. All right, I'm just going to skip through a few. And lastly, fulfill any pledge you make in God's name, and do not break oaths after you have sworn them, for you have made God your surety. Do not use your oaths to deceive each other. So we have rounded out all the 5 principles. Really can be, I guess, narrowed down to jihad and covenant or mithaq, but I like nice round numbers, so I went for 5. Linked to this are 5 virtues. The reason why I separated out virtues and principles is that not all of the verses on warfare have to do with legal doctrine. These are hortatory in nature. So the hortatory verses call to steadfastness, courage, generosity, and loyalty, and they call away from despair, cowardice, and stinginess and treacherousness. So these vices are associated with the wars of aggression that the unbelievers were engaged in, whereas the people who are doing proper just war the values that they hold to are the virtues that I've listed here. Now, the only one I want to talk about is forgiveness and toughness. This is the only one where sometimes toughness is called for in the Quranic discourse with the unbelievers. But the discourse should be understood as a carrot and stick approach. This is God's attitude towards humankind, and also the attitude that the believers should have with the unbelievers, is that, hey, if you come to peace, we're ready for peace. But if you war with us, well, we're really going to give you hell. So that's really what that first part is. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these, but if in the questions, I can definitely. I just want to quickly go to the difficult verses now. So I do want to read this passage. This passage is often, this has been analyzed in Professor Firestone's book. I want to go through my reading of it, and then I believe it will show that it's a much more intuitive reading of it. So, fight in God's cause against those who fight you. This is the proportionality principle. But do not aggress. This is the non-aggression principle. God does not love aggressors. Kill them wherever you encounter them and drive them out from wherever they drove you out. This is the proportionality principle. For persecution is more serious than killing. But do not fight them near the sacred precinct unless they first attack you there. This is the non-aggression principle. But if they do not attack you there, kill them. The proportionality principle. Such is the recompense of the disbelievers. But if they desist from fighting, then you desist too, because God is forgiving and merciful. This is the virtue of forgiveness, as well as the principle of non-aggression. Fight them until there is no more persecution, and religion is for God. Proportionality principle. I have another slide on this. We'll talk about this one. But if they desist from fighting, there can be no further aggression except towards aggressors. This is the non-aggression principle. A sacred month for a sacred month, violation of sanctity calls for equal retribution. This is the proportionality principle. You violate a sacred month, we get to violate a sacred month. Attack him as he attacked you. This is the proportionality principle, but be mindful of God. So this I'm comparing to the classical scholars, how they read this, and how Professor Firestone analyzes it. I believe the difficulty lies in trying to take and splitting verses off. I believe that creates confusion. So Professor Firestone writes that verse 2190 and 2191 do not belong together. He says their relational placement by the collectors of the Quran was designed in order to make perfectly clear that the limitations into warfare in 2190 were abrogated by the nearly limitless proclamation of 2191. But I believe Professor Firestone has it backward. The collectors of the Qur'an were not the same people who were making the jurists who were making the doctrine of jihad, because they wouldn't have to use the doctrine of jihad in the first place if that were the case. They had to invoke it because it already existed in the Qur'an. I'm running out of time, but basically I think that Professor Firestone answers his own question, that it does specify the information he asks about in verse 2:191. Also, I don't think that verse 2:191 calls for a nearly limitless proclamation as he claims. Where it says, kill them wherever you encounter them, in fact, this likely meant kill them wherever they attack you. The second part of the verse, drive them where they drove you out, clearly indicates this and goes back to the principle of proportionality discussed earlier. And furthermore, the verse itself goes on, do not fight them unless they fight you. How can this be a limitless proclamation of war? I'm going to skip through this one since I'm running out of time. Yes. I just wanted to talk about, hold on, while I have time. Let me go to verse 9.5. So verse 9.5 is the sword verse. It's said to abrogate all of the peaceful verses. I don't think it indicates that at all. If you look at the red part, it's again showing, it's the carrot and stick approach, and there is the carrot in there as well. Plus, this had to do with the violation after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That's indicated by the first verse in that surah, exonerated our God and his messenger from the treaty you made with the idolaters. And other verses in there clearly indicate that this is only to do with those who violated the treaty. As long as they remain true to you, you be true to them. It's only for such idolaters who violate the treaty. And the Qur'an makes it clear that they are the ones who are committing aggression. Now you might say, this might be, just creating a situation to justify warfare. Maybe, but that actually proves the point further, that the Qur'an is at pains to describe the action as non-aggressive in nature. And here we see in the same passage that it's not an endless proclamation of war. It's, again, the carrot and stick. There's still a hope that maybe the unbelievers will desist. To give the cherry on top, I will look at this verse. This is considered one of the last verses of the Qur'an. After the conquest of Mecca, this day I have perfected your religion for you. Right before it, let not the hatred of people toward you for shutting you out of the sacred mosque lead you to aggression, and cooperate in righteousness and piety, but do not cooperate in sin and aggression, udwan. So, the Prophet had conquered Mecca, and now he is actually going back to the same ethic of forgiveness. We see this here in the same passage, let not the hatred of others make you swerve to do wrong and depart from justice. So, someone said to the Prophet, this is now in the tafsir, but we can take it, today is a day of vengeance, and he said, no, today is a day of mercy. So, going back to the same passage that I started with, I do think that this describes the Prophet's relationship to the unbelievers as far as war was concerned. He defended himself when he felt oppressed. He called for equal retaliation, and then later on he was patient and forgiving. Lastly, real quick, I just want to say that the sacred months, I think they're very important. From stage 3 to stage 4, the change is that supposedly in stage 3 of jihad, warfare was permitted in all of the months other than the sacred months, and then they were phased out in stage 4. I don't think the evidence indicates that at all. Here we have a statement to the Prophet saying that he does claim to observe the sacred months. But more importantly, looking at the Quranic verses, we see that there's no place in the Quran where the sacred months are abrogated. In fact, they're reinforced. Even the verses that are used supposedly as evidence, I think, show the opposite. Fighting in that month is a great offense. God decrees that there are 12 months, 4 months of which are sacred. A sacred month for a sacred month. This is just qisas. It's not an abrogation. The qisas wouldn't be triggered if the sacred months did not continue to exist. This verse, I don't know how this verse is used so much to say that the sacred months are abrogated. It's saying to kill them after the sacred months have passed. That wouldn't be necessary if killing was okay in the sacred months. The Quran could have just disavowed them, just like it did, these are the names of your gods, or like when the Prophet married the ex-wife of Zayd. They could have just said, given justification for that these sacred months are not in God's sight, you made these up, but it doesn't do that. So, lastly, just last point, I think this actually indicates how the doctrine of jihad evolved. As the Muslims moved out of Arabia, the sacred months probably became less useful. Other empires did not follow them. So like the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, they didn't follow the sacred months. So they became less relevance, and Muslims felt that they would be disadvantageous to not fight in those months. So I think they became phased out gradually. So this means that the change in the warfare from tribal warfare to what I call imperial warfare was a gradual process of cultural evolution, not, as Professor Firestone argues, a jump or occurring in a very short period. I believe it took place after the Prophet's death and as the Muslims expanded outside of Arabia. These are the implications of my study, and I will cede my time. Thank you.
I'll leave it. Just